Hi, and welcome to Interprofessional Conversations, where we elevate your health and wellness through sharing knowledge. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm your co-host, Chris Foreman, along with Dr. Giancarlo Licata. This week's guest is Jill Miller, co-founder of Tune Up Fitness Worldwide and creator of the self-care fitness formats Yoga Tune Up and the Role Model Method. With more than 30 years of study in anatomy and movement, she is a pioneer in forging relevant links between the worlds of fitness, yoga, massage, athletics, and pain management. As the creator of some of the world's best mobility tools, she has crafted original programs for 24-hour fitness, Equinox, YogaWorks, and numerous professional sports teams. Jill's work has been featured in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, O Magazine, Shape, Men's Journal, Good Housekeeping, Women's Health, Yoga Journal, The Today Show, and Good Morning America, and is frequently featured on the Oprah Winfrey Network. In this episode, we dive into her work on all things fascia related. We discuss today's challenges with poor anxiety tolerance, fascia in the brain, her journey with yoga and the Omega Institute, and how body workers can collaborate with mental health professionals. We're excited to share this episode with you, so without further ado, here's Dr. Licata and Jill Miller.
All right, well, Jill, I'm so excited to have you here. I appreciate you finally joining us here after 2 years of our conversations back in March of 2019. So first of all, welcome. Second of all, I like to open the conversation with going into how are you seeing the challenges of today? What are you seeing are some of the biggest challenges with your clients and just maybe, or you and your own life, and how we can begin to start this conversation? What are you seeing? What's going on?
Well, I am within the culture of the Los Angeles, greater Los Angeles environment. And I think what I'm picking up on as a heightened irritant that we're all encountering worldwide, not just in Los Angeles, is the constancy of the challenge of the pandemic. And that pressure alone, I think, has really altered our anxiety tolerance. Now, I'm not a mental health professional, so those of you who are LMTs or psychs that are listening to this, maybe you have a more proper term for it. But what I really see is that because we have ratcheted up to the unpredictability of everything, from shipping containers, off the coast of Long Beach, not being able to get Christmas presents to your friends in Montana or Florida this year because of that, and an oil spill potentially because of that, and the uncountableness of those that you normally count on, services that you count on, or even family members because they just got sick. So those are just sort of some of the micro and macro things that I think have adjusted this sort of global anxiety level. And I think that the first place that it exposes itself is yourself. And why am I so uncomfortable? Why am I having heightened pain? Why am I having these symptoms? And, in each person having to come across their own version of what does that adjusted anxiety lever look like? How does it manifest in my body? And then how does that manifest behaviorally with your immediate family, with groups that you're involved with, employees or other colleagues? So, and then, I think the upshot pain of that is that it can become very difficult to communicate well with others with that adjusted level of threat and anxiety, and you see it all over the place. And I'm not immune. I'm certainly not immune to any of this, and I have found myself not listening in many ways, but also trying to build new skills of seeing many different sides and many different perspectives that I never thought I'd ever consider entertaining.
Right. And so there's if I recap what you were saying, there's an unpredictability of everything, right? Like my day, I don't know how my day is going to go today.
Nope.
Right? I can try to plan my day, but like we were talking, off air, wait a second, is the nanny going to show up or not show up today? We don't know. Is the school going to call or not call today? Do I need to just randomly pick up my child halfway through the day? That makes it hard, and that's like on a daily level, right? In every dimension, right?
Yes.
And so now, what I love about this conversation, and I hope to kind of dive deeper into this, is your expertise is really in the body, and yet we're going to see that it does not end in the body. Um, but so if I'm dealing with the unpredictability of life and it's creating this sense of anxiety or the sense of my tolerance to anxiety has gone down, I'm going to feel it in my body, right? It is going to be here. And I love the way you describe it. There becomes an inner conflict. I can almost feel like my body is fighting itself, or there's tension and there's things stopping each other. So what is your, we're going to kind of dive a little bit into your background here. What have you been dealing with the body, fascia, yoga? What is your lens through which you're seeing something like anxiety tolerance? What is your lens?
Yeah. So yes, I have a few different subspecialties in how I incorporate different tools of fascia awareness, self-massage, teach self-massage specifically to help people address their own aches and pains, and we can get really complicated and in depth with that. But just on a superficial level, I teach people to do their own home care, and I also teach mechanics and movement. So it's not just that we teach people self-massage and then hope for the best. Then they also have to improve their movement and their mechanics. I don't typically address lifestyle stuff that a lot of other practitioners do. I don't. You gotta get your sleep. I mean, because if they do this stuff, they're going to fall into better and better sleep, and then that dives into what I'm working on now, which is, I can't not talk about it, which is a book that really teaches people how to compound different parasympathetic tools that are all body based to help them with self-regulation. And that is self-regulation in movement, self-regulation in expression, self-regulation in connection, in emotional connection.
Wow.
So these, when somebody comes in to my, well, let's call it my Zoom space, if I'm doing one-on-one work, I have not been able to take clients during the pandemic for a number of reasons, but mainly because I've used the whole pandemic as not a writing sabbatical, because I haven't stopped doing all my other work, but I'm 7 years late on the book that I'm writing. And so I've had to say no to almost everything. You were the only podcast, by the way, that I said yes to in the past 6 months.
Oh my goodness.
Jill.
Oh.
So also I'm finding myself, here's post-pandemic mouth. Like, have you talked to anybody, Jill? Like, I have. You're the first like channel that I've like trying to deliver messages to. So forgive me as I go round and round to talk to you about what I'm seeing or what I'm hearing from the people that teach my work, the teachers that teach my work out in the world. But I've totally lost track of the question now. So re-ask it. Maybe we can try that one again.
What I love about this, and this is right, because we're all doing this, right? Again, all of our usual channels have been disrupted, right? And so this is it. This is what we're talking about, right? And the fact is, no one is immune to this, right? And so as practitioners, because that's going to be our audience, as practitioners, we're here to give answers for our clients, and yet we're in the middle of it too, right? We're going through the same challenges and transitions, and so right on. And so okay, so
great, I answered the question.
Yeah, no, and also what I want our audience to first just know is that you've been doing this for how long? 30 years?
Oh my gosh. I have been teaching the work that I'm teaching, or some iteration of it. I started teaching yoga when I was 19 years old, and I'm going to be 50 in January. And so it's been a long culmination of this work. But my favorite work, which is what the book's about, is really the relationship of the respiratory diaphragm and its fascial continuities and how that impacts respiration, mechanics, all the things.
Yeah. Yes, and so not only are you, what I want to do is set the stage for our listeners so they understand this isn't just somebody who's kind of late to the game and who has, listened to a couple people, try to synthesize some information, then goes out and tries to make, come up with some of her ideas. You've been in this, you've been dealing with the body and the mind and the spirit for, 30 plus years. You're the founder of Yoga Fitness, which is almost becoming its kind of empire. And you have
Tune Up Fitness is the company name. My husband, Tune Up Fitness Worldwide. My husband, when we were coming up with a company name, because I already had coined this thing Yoga Tune Up, which brought functional movement into the yoga space back in 2001. That was my first format that I created. 2004 was when I coined the term. And when I met my husband a few years later, he was like, we need to bottle this, because he couldn't believe what he experienced in the classroom. And he had all these ideas. And I was like, oh, I don't want to do that. I don't want to teach teacher trainings and have to put a manual together and all the stuff. And he kept pushing me to live up to my potential. And he was right. And we came up with a company name called Tune Up Fitness, because he knew back then that he wanted to make sure that we branded bigger than the word yoga. And he thought at the time that the word yoga would be a turnoff to a lot of people, mainly him. but I totally understood what his ideas were.
Yeah, or a significant group of a significant percentage of the population that has a certain bias, and it's an ignorant bias, but it's still a bias nonetheless, right? So good. So it's Tune Up Fitness worldwide now. Okay, so that's one. How many teachers have gone through your training programs roughly?
Oh gosh, well, there are thousands and thousands of educators or clinicians that have gone through 8 different programs that I created. 2 of them are certifications. So we have thousands of people that have been, I would say, adjusted their outlook on what's possible in not only a yoga classroom, but how do you disassemble movement and make it relevant and meaningful to people so that they understand, why they're doing what they're doing, but also then there's this mush of self-treatment strategies that came into play, which is the role model work, the self-massage. And so it's not just yoga tune-up that we do, but we have this other thing called role model method, which goes way beyond the yoga space. And that has legs, or it has rolling legs, that has permeated the planet into, all manner of civic service, the militaries in different countries, which I can't name, of course, athletics, clinics, and then general population, as well as global fitness. So we've been able to really move this message of self-care, healthcare, especially via educating people about fascia, what it is, why it matters, and and moving this so that when people come to visit somebody like you or other health professionals, hopefully the client is already coming in at a slightly higher level of education and is able to adapt more quickly to treatments, and also apply treatments at home in between, or not even need treatments that are maybe they can prevent their own issues from occurring in the first place.
Right, and empower the individual again, right? Give them ownership again over their body, and so you've got not only the breadth over 30 years and thousands of educators and clinicians, but you also have depth, right? So you've also you co-authored and you wrote a chapter in fascia function and medical applications.
Yeah.
Right, and that was a whole chapter on self myofascial release.
Yes.
I see. Are you digging it up? There it is. Right. So there's the textbook there. So and we'll include a link on the show notes for this. And so there you go into the deeper anatomy, the physiology of why you do the things that you're doing, why the fascia and movement is so important. Is that correct?
Well, this chapter was not about me. Unlike my book, which is really about my work and my perspective, this chapter, I was summoned by David Lazondak to write a chapter for a medical textbook on fascia. And the first response to him was, well, I'm not a medical writer, David, so I don't know why you're asking me to do this. And he says, because you have been in the trenches for years. And I know David from the Fascia Research Society and from the Fascia Research Congresses, where, that's where the fascia geeks hang out and swap stories and learn all the things. And when he asked me to write it, I said no. And then he convinced me that I could. It took me a year to write, I don't know, then 13 pages of this chapter, because I had to read basically almost every paper ever written on self-myofascial release. I thought I was going to die, although there aren't that many, because self-myofascial release research didn't even appear until 1991, I think. And so there's just over 100 peer-reviewed papers in quality journals. And then I also found stuff that was, like secret society stuff that was fun to read also.
Secret society stuff. Okay.
Well, I mean, not peer reviewed, but just interesting things, interesting studies that people had done that didn't end up in journals, right?
Yeah.
So I read a few of those, but I also was trying to be very scientific in inclusion and exclusion and that sort of thing, even though I'm not a scientist. But now I can actually say that I'm a researcher because I wrote this chapter. But
Yes.
So it wasn't about my approach or my work.
Right.
And so that was fun to put aside my biases and all my thinking. But of course, it was there in the back of my mind, like, well, why didn't these people come to why were there so many conflicting consensuses? And why did foam rolling work sometimes and didn't work other times? And, what it made me see was where all the holes were in the research. And that was so exciting to see all these missing links. And also then I was definitely considering why why there were so many disparate results in certain categories. And I definitely have my hypotheses of why that is. And that was very affirming for me, that not everything is known, that so much more needs to be researched. And, this isn't really a huge hot topic because it doesn't get the kind of funding that, some other more,
Right.
deadly fascia issues might present, right?
Yes. The acuteness of the problem is not. It doesn't make the evening news, right?
Yes.
But yeah, it can be more as we're going to go a little bit deeper, Jill. But it can become so insidious that it begins to weave its way throughout many of our chronic health and mental health issues, right? And so, but what your chapter reveals is that you have some depth of understanding of the physiology, right?
For sure.
That's important for our listeners, and that maybe that's hopefully going to be a good segue, Jill, for us as we kind of dive a little bit deeper into, well, what is the role of fascia, and we'll go into definitions, but how can we begin to understand fascia and the brain kind of around the self-regulation conversation? And so I'm going to just throw out some terms. We can begin to define some of them, and we can kind of see which rabbit holes we want to chase. But I'll open it up by asking, what is the relationship between fascia and our nervous system, and how is it relevant for this problem that we identified, this self-regulation problem? How can we begin to explore this?
All right, I have the chills. So the first thing that you and your listeners should know is that of all of the papers at the time, this was as of December 2019, that all of the, that I submitted the end. Oh God, was it 2019 or was it 2020? No, it had to be 2019, right before all this Michigas.
I remember there's a whole year and a half that like is kind of like we've repressed it from our memory, right? Like it's just yeah, okay.
Before all the Michigas. Okay, so there was only one paper that addressed self massage and connected it to mental health.
Okay, wow.
Now, not that rolling and rubbing doesn't affect other brain related processes, but I just want to isolate that they're not those researchers, nobody is really looking yet. There's some stuff happening now, but looking at what does that self massage element look like in terms of a a non-medicated medication way, a non-chemical way of adjusting your own mental health, happiness, and self-regulation. And the result they found, or the population they did the rolling with, was in England, and it was caretakers of people who were caretaking family members with Alzheimer's. But they didn't just isolate self-massage; they were also doing it with breath work, and I think they were doing it with some other meditation practice. So there were like three things that they gave these caretaker people. So you couldn't just isolate and say, oh, well, the self-massage did it. Right. But nonetheless, that was great to see that a decent study showed that, but I would say, a lot of the other studies also talked about pain. And I would say that is just a great topic in general when we're talking about the brain, because it really has been shown to adjust pain sensitivity. It really attenuates your pain pressure threshold. And when you're not so obsessed or occupied with the experience of pain, your brain is free to do other things. So I'd say that's a really great overall finding that is mostly consistent.
Okay. Can I pretend to understand some of this and try my best to recap it, and then we'll
sure.
we can wrap this up and take it somewhere. So the fascia. The fascia is something that not a lot of our practitioners may be too familiar with. We'll definitely go into it, and I'll ask you to define it in a second. But somehow there's this thing called the fascia, and somehow it seems to be related to most, if not everything, both around our body, in our body, through our body. And it has at the very least impact on the sensors that influence our brain, and not just our brain, but our whole kind of state, our current state of awareness, and we can kind of go into that. So is that like a fair kind of rough?
Oh yeah, great. So thank you. Now I know where your question wants to go. So our fascia, you can think of it as the soft tissue skeleton of the body. It is fluid, it is loaded with liquid, being a fluid structure, and it is a high density of collagen fibers as well as elastin. And it's a very highly mobile mesh that suspends, enrobes, and interconnects everything together from cell to skin and everything in between. You can't have a body without its fascial connecting tissue. And most people are familiar with it. They can identify it because they have eaten at some point in their life, or they've seen other people eat meat, and they prepare meat. And when you're preparing meat, you can see white, cobwebby, stringy stuff. Sometimes it's tougher, other times it's thinner, it's filmier. And that would be a great way for you to just sort of locate in your brain, oh, I guess that's what fascia might kind of look like. That's what it looks like when it's exposed to oxygen and it's been oxidized. It looks like that white kind of saran wrappy film that's threading throughout meat or wrapping meat. Right. But we have this all over our body. And what's super cool about fascia in terms of the nervous system and thus thy brain is that your fascia is it's like a depot center with not just thousands and not just millions, but hundreds of millions of sensory nerve endings. In fact, Martin Grunwald, a German researcher, I think it was in the last 2.5 years, maybe 2018, or maybe late 2017, he, initially they thought, oh, there's about 100 million nerve endings in the fascial tissues. And everyone was like, oh my God, that's so many. What are they doing there? And then he did a whole reassessment and recalculation, and that's what mathematicians do, I guess, and figure out a better way to look at it. And he found 250 million sensory nerve endings in the fascial body. And so it's really like, what the heck are they all doing there? And so Robert Schleip, who's one of the founders of the Fascia Research Congress, he says that fascia is our most sensory rich organ, eclipsing the skin, eclipsing even the eyes, which is just kind of bananas. Like, we are this feeling creature. We're such a sensory creature. And touch and pressure and shear, all the different categories of, of touch, is primal to us, more so than these other senses. And I'll just cap this off with, and just 3 days ago, I don't know if you get the headlines from the New York Times, but the new Nobel Prize awards in physiology and medicine both went to touch guys. So touch and heat perception. They finally figured out the channel of the piezo, one, two, I don't know, and TRNPV 1, 2, 3, I don't know, numbers and letters that, but it's just incredible what I think is about to happen. What is it? It's always about to happen, right, Giancarlo? It's always about to happen. What's about to happen for those of us who use touch directly or indirectly, like I do, to help populations.
Yeah, that's so huge because going back to, again, this anxiety tolerance, is that what you used as a term?
I made up that term.
Yeah, I love it. Going back to that, what we know, and I'm not sure that all of our listeners know, is that there is constant signaling happening from the body up to the brain, constant, right? And here we have 250 million sensors that are constantly telling the brain both where we are in space and how safe, quote unquote, safe our environment is internally. Because whether or not these are what we call kind of, pressure sensors, like our proprioceptors and mechanoreceptors, or pain sensors, which are our nociceptors, they're constantly bombarding the brain with input, right? And, a mental health practitioner, because we have at least a third of our group are mental health practitioners, it's, I think, important for them to know, and many do, that that client's anxiety tolerance, level of arousal, is going to be heavily influenced by these internal states, right? And we can talk about things all day long, but that body is yelling, and how can we begin to maybe turn that down? That's something that you have really deep insight into.
Yeah, there's a lot to say there. So the language of the body is touch, and that's my opinion.
Yeah.
And there was a time when I was trying to teach the shoulder girdle to a group of yogis, and I was just I'm always trying to find better ways of explaining to people, right? I don't have I do have a few, here's my pat answer, but usually I like to adjust things for context. And also, are people understanding what I'm saying? And if they're not, I really need to try to explain better. And so saying that touch is the language of the body, I say that another way, which is my body thinks in feels. My body thinks in feels.
Oh.
Feels, right?
Yeah, not and feels, but in feels.
No,
yes.
not and feels. My body thinks and feels.
Yeah.
Because we have this exorbitant number of little mini brains all over the body, or at least pulses coming from all over the body with very specific messages that our brain is going to interpret or misinterpret or throw off to some other center. And that's going to adjust our behavior, or make us have a certain, feel a certain way. So we have those positional sensors, the proprioceptors, they're all ending in fascia. They're all terminating in connective tissue, whether you're talking about Pacini corpuscle, Ruffini endings, or or the other one that I can't remember right now, Golgi tendon organs, muscle spindles. That's fascia, folks. Those little nerve endings, they're just hooked in there, and they're listening for movement in the connective tissue to say, oh, bebop, 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 to your brain. And similarly, we have these interstitial nerve endings that are also sending input. We're not sure everything that's happening in all the interstitial nerve endings. Are fascinating because we don't really know how to measure them. It's not me. I'm not in a research lab, but my friends who are, they're like, well, I don't really know how to test for those. But Bud Craig has certainly done a lot of work on interoception and is able to create really clear and cogent descriptions and research around all of these other feels that the body has through the pain and temperature channel of the body, but also these visceral feels that we have, right? These urges that we have from inside that are perceivable, right? The movement of our heart, the movement of blood, the movement of breath are really obvious, but the gurgling in our innards, our hunger for sex, our need to pee, these are all additional feels of interoceptors. And apparently they're also embedded in fascia, but I have no idea what's happening there. I mean, I do. I have an idea with some, but for some of the others, I don't have any answers for you.
Yeah.
But it's all very, very, some of this field is very, very new in terms of, well, what do we do with the feels? And that's where the mental health pros can really help with this collection of body data coming up, but only using the mind to address the body, I think can be problematic. And we really need to have a two-way conversation. We have to have a feel to mind and a mind into the feel to have both hands talking to one another and finding that mutual peace zone, I suppose.
Yes, yes, yes. It's a great reminder that the interprofessional community has at its foundation a very oversimplified concept that that we need a meta perspective through which each health practitioner can see how their unique contribution fits in a larger whole. And so, again, I'll just say it again, that we need right now a meta perspective where each individual practitioner can see where their discipline and expertise fits into a larger whole. And
amen.
Okay, great. Good.
I rely on all of the different minds and body minds
Yes.
try to figure out this thing of being human and why we have these experiences.
Yeah. And so another gross oversimplification that we have is at the very least we can talk about three different lenses through which we need all three to solve some of these complex challenges like chronic pain, mental health, so on. And these simplified three lenses are a biochemical lens, a mental health lens, and a structural physical lens, right? So biochemical, mental health, and structural. Let's just say structural. We can say or physical. And so it's a gross oversimplification, but it helps begin the conversation around how does a yoga instructor understand the contribution that their work is going to have with that individual, with the client, when the client may also have a therapist. And how can the therapist and the yoga instructor or the yoga therapist, how can they work together? But they're going to need a common language, right? How will the functional medicine doctor, and we have many in our group, how can they begin to understand that while this client has some kind of autoimmune issue, they also need to look at the structural as well as how they're going to process all the emotional, mental things that are going on. And so it's oversimplified, but it gives everybody a starting point, right? And so what I love about your work is that you're in it, and you see how it's all connected. And yet,
Fascia has a way of doing that, as AT Still said, and then re-echoed by my colleague Tom Myers. Fascia is where all the branches of medicine come together. And so I have to learn about lymph.
yes.
Unfortunately, I have to learn about neurons. It's so painful. I have to learn about the elbow joint.
Yeah.
I have to learn about the body's urges to do or not do things. Like I have to learn about so many different things. And so I I will never not come back to the connective tissue, because it really does help as a linchpin, um, to organize and also to treat. So to know, what approach to take, what body area to work with, and what tone to be at, in there, what tool to use, all of the things.
That's wonderful. And so that's a great segue then for us to dive deeper into then. Your new book is going to be coming out. It's called Body by Breath. Is
Yeah.
that, yes. February 2022. Is that still?
Oh, I mean, that's what's on Amazon. I don't know how we're gonna do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have no idea, because of how complex. Every time I think, oh, we're kind of getting close, it just gets more complicated. It's wonderful though, and I just keep learning. And so just, now I can include the Nobel Prize stuff in it. So it's kind of good that every moment something new is happening. So there's a certain point where my publisher is just going to say, stop it.
Right. At some point, we have to just cut and say that it's good.
But
We're going to contain it to this body of work. But it's a wonderful segue into what the intersection is between the fascia, the diaphragm, which will introduce some of Stephen Porges' Polyvagal Theory,
sure.
and arousal, how we're dealing back with this anxiety intolerance, right? So here you are, you have all this background with fascia, and how can we begin to now connect some dots and say the fascia, here's a practical example, here's fascia, it affects diaphragm affects breath work, and through the breath work and its relationship through the vagal system has an impact on changing our anxiety tolerance, right? Can we dive into that? Can we start with the diaphragm? What is the diaphragm? What is it doing? What are the fascial connections?
All right. So the respiratory diaphragm is an irregular dome-ish shaped muscle that lines the six lower ribs of your body. You have two hemispheres of this dome that collect together in a central tendon. So you can think of the diaphragm as like an umbrella. It's a partition between the lower viscera of your digestive center and the upper viscera of your lungs and your heart.
Okay.
Your heart sits on top of the diaphragm, like a little sofa. So it rests on the diaphragm. So when we think of cardiopulmonary, like literally they're sewn together, and out of the central tendon there's this beautiful sac, this connective tissue sheath called the pericardium that encases the heart. And you have these three holes puncturing the center of the diaphragm that allow for food to pass through. So we already know, oh my God, something's going to happen with the heart with your diaphragm. And wait a minute, the food's going through it. Okay, so something in the digestive situation is going to be connected to the diaphragm. And then you've got your aorta, which is back to the heart. And then we have the vagus nerve and some other nerves as well, but the vagus nerve just thundering its way through from your brain down into all of your subdiaphragmatic organs. So we've got this this throughway from really body to brain, brain to body, and the diaphragm's tension and its motion allows for harmony or disharmony to show up. Now the diaphragm's connected to ribs and spine. It has these tails that follow along the front of the lumbar spine, a little bit lower on the right side, a little bit higher on the left side. These are called the crura. And as the diaphragm nestles its way to hook into the lower back, it passes over two very famous muscles, quadratus lumborum and the psoas. And so those connections into the ribs, into those powerful muscles, into the spine, also obviously show us there's a musculoskeletal component, there's a postural component to respiration, to this main driver of breath. So we're tying a lot of systems together. And then in terms of the immune system, the cisterna Kylie, or whatever her name is, your main lymphs, your biggest pool of lymph is just below the respiratory diaphragm, and the diaphragm's movement really helps to chug it up and slurp it right back up into circulation. So there is no system that the diaphragm is disinvolved with. Even in terms of things that we will often attribute to brain function. I read a study recently that it was an aging population. Everybody had difficulty with balance. This is, they look at ankle, range of motion, they look at standing one leg test. And then they did osteopathic maneuvers on the diaphragms of these people, and everybody's balance improved. So it was like, oh, well, vestibular balance and the diaphragm. So, I mean, there's so many connections, and I think it's just going to be an endless unwinding continuously through all time that we discover, the importance of the health of diaphragm and its implications. So it really is like a node in the body, and everything connects to it. Yeah. I think it's the most important muscle, which is why I'm writing a whole book about it. And I feel like more poems should be written about the diaphragm. I mean, the heart's important, but I'm going to just say, like, let's put the diaphragm on a throne and revere it and celebrate it.
Because it's so foundational and fundamental.
It's just so foundational, and you can't live without one.
Yeah.
And I did come to learn about the diaphragm as a very young child. My mother has horrible asthma, and it was really bad when I was a child because she smoked, which was not good for her asthma. But she got run to the hospital a number of times, when I was a toddler. And so you don't forget at an early age that without breath you die. And I think that, and then becoming a vocalist early on and learning about the diaphragm through vocal training, that was really the start. And then, much longer journey into, other studies, yoga studies, massage studies, cadaver studies, and then the fascia community studies.
So then here's this.
Oh, you wanted to know what fascia is connected to? We didn't talk about that, but we can put that on pause.
Incredibly important area. It plays a pivotal part of so many systems, and so thus our health as well as our mental health. Yeah, what's the deal with the fascia, and how does it connecting, and why are fascial restrictions somewhere else in the body or there specifically begin to impact this key area? How's that happening?
Okay, so I think let me just say first that I would say that probably 10 years ago, if you asked this question, undoubtedly the majority of my answer would be on a mechanical level, and I mean like structural mechanical.
Right.
And now I think because so much more research has shown that it's obviously there's a structural mechanical component, but the neural embedment into fascial tissues is you can't not talk about neural fascia, or the neural field within the connective tissue to be able to answer any question, because there's going to be a mechanical, or what Tom Myers calls spatial medicine answer, and then there's also, then let's try to think through reflexes, and let's try to think through is the fascia healthy? Is there fluid enough for nerve conduction to correctly operate? So in terms of the diaphragm, the diaphragm has very few sensory neurons embedded in it. I think there are 10 muscle spindles. Excuse me. It has very few proprioceptors. Let me start again. It has sensory neurons, but proprioceptors. So you can't feel where the diaphragm is in your body. Like, just try. Sit here right now and determine, like, I can feel exactly where my elbows are.
Yeah.
And I can do some things with my ribs, and I can feel my ribs are, but right. I still can't feel where my diaphragm is. unless I manipulate the tissues to which it connects. And so a huge part of and even when I'm manipulating the tissues to which it connects, I still can't feel the diaphragm, but I can have a pretty good guess of where it is. If I take a really big abdominal inhale and my gut pooches out, I know my diaphragm is contracted and it's descended.
Right.
If I do something.
Yeah, even when I'm sitting here, I can feel my low back even as I'm taking breaths. I can feel some of the side ribs, and I can feel my abdominal muscles and maybe restrictions in all three. But
right, you probably get that
feel,
muscle spindle feedback from them.
yes, so but it's coming from them. I'm not feeling my actual diaphragm.
No, isn't it creepy?
Yeah,
It's
weird.
so
Yeah.
hidden. It is like my octopus teacher. Like it's just hiding in there. It's doing its thing. And
I love that. Yeah, yeah, totally. Just
like
up in shells.
it doesn't want you to know about it unless you have a spasm, which is called the hiccups.
Interesting.
Right. So with these very few muscle spindles that are located in the crura, by the way, and I've heard that is, I'm not going to even say, I've got to go back into my chapter and make sure I know what I'm talking about.
Sure.
And so it's hard to locate the diaphragm. And so in order to locate the diaphragm, we want to really contact and connect with the tissues that it's connected to. And so that's going to include all of the known core muscles, the famous core muscles, and their relations, all their relations. So one we'll get to know through palpation. I use the Corgis ball as my number one tool for trunk palpation that really helps to manipulate the shape of your trunk with pressure, with position, with shear. The ball is super grippy, and so it can apply shear to your skin. But then inside,
is kind of like it looks like a deflated, slightly deflated
like a Pilates ball.
Pilates ball, but it's less inflated than maybe a typical ball that you would.
Yeah, I usually have one in my. I don't have one by my office. Oh, yeah, I actually have a deflated one in my like gym bag. It's totally deflated. But so we inflate it. You're right. We inflate it to different levels of pressure, the comfort level, and have people either rest on it on the ground, or if people are dealing with difficulty getting to the ground issues, we can do this in chair with self pressure, or even leaning against the wall. But it gives the body this pressure feedback. It also gives shear force. But then on the inside, what you're doing as an embodied person is you're applying internal breath pressure in different ways in order to create excursion, both of the diaphragm, the ribs, and and because we tried this in different positions, we really celebrate these different anchors that the diaphragm hooks into. And this is a chance for me to teach about zones of respiration, and of course, different fascial connections. And inevitably, people end up conquering pain that they didn't even know they had, or eliminate, they just feel so free, they feel so different and altered afterwards. Especially if they've never had, visceral work or gut work or rib cage work, which most people have not had. Maybe in this community they have, but the general public and fitness culture, I started bringing abdominal massage into classrooms in 2001 was the first time I brought a self-abdominal massage tool into a classroom and made people do what I'd been doing since I was 19 years old.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And it's I've done quite a lot of work in the past, and then I'll take like a 10-year hiatus and and totally disconnect from my body for a good decade, and then circle back around, and then it's like this remembering, right? This reconnection, like an old family member that you haven't seen for a long time, but you feel really, really good, warm, fuzzy feelings about. And so, and it seems fitting now with all of us sitting all day long on our computers or on Zoom, like we're doing now, watching news and feeling very over aroused and very tense. And I know in my body, I feel it right there. Like it's literally my upper abdominals where I'll feel a lot of that,
Interesting.
right? And so to then take a second and say, well, wait a second, let me just first feel here. Let me just direct some attention here and let me get this gorgeous ball and put some pressure and breathe into it. Just the feedback alone begins to kind of, it begins to open things up. I feel like literally I feel like there's more like space in my mind, right? And
that description, I hear that all the time. There is just this really quick neural adjustment. And I think it's through pressure sensitivity via the vagus that's making this happen. We don't have research on it. I like literally in my inbox, I have, a vagus nerve scientist, and I'm always hounding him like, where else are there pressure sensors in the vagus? Like, can you help me with this? I don't know. Certain questions are just I always have difficulty finding answers, but they know that visceral massage is so helpful for, digestion, for visceral adhesion, for scar tissue mobilization, for fertility. And obviously you can't get there if you're freaking out. And so, your body does go into this, I would call it like hopefully a conscious placid place. We can talk about polyvagal theory and we can talk about dissociation, but that also happens with correct hosting from a practitioner and really being present with a body, with a person that's going through these type of interventions to try to stay present or stay with it or allow feelings to emerge. But I got an email this morning from a woman with a TBI, traumatic brain injury, concussive or symptoms that she was struggling with after she was hit by the pole of a wind sail. What is that sailing that you do just standing?
I don't know. I think a wind sail.
Wind sail that that conked her on the head, and 4 years of her life disappeared with symptoms beyond the ability for any clinician or therapist to help her with. She was in absolute agony. The one common thread with all of the clinicians said, try breath work. That was the one thing that people said to her. And she found herself finally committing to trying to do breath work. And she got up with this team of folks down in Encinitas, our breath collective, which some friends of mine started, and they're huge fans of the Gorgeous Ball, and they started integrating Gorgeous Ball work into their stuff. Anyway, long story short, it was like, I don't know, week 2, they introduced the Gorgeous Ball, and she said when she didn't know what was happening to her, but all of a sudden, all of these symptoms, not all of them, but like a number of symptoms and this chronic sympathetic state that she was locked in. She could not get parasympathetic. Something finally changed in her body, in her life. And it has been the pivot point. She's now her body is now allowing her to heal. Right. But it took, really laying on the Gorgeous Ball and being guided correctly with the use of the tool that finally was able to really get her nervous system to be a compliant, nimble, resilient nervous system again. Her brain was holding her hostage in her body. Horrible. But just think of it, if it can do that for somebody with TBI, someone who just like got, low level adjusted anxiety because of the pandemic.
Right. Yes. And so again, it's our body, our physical body, our soma is an access point, right? Like as a general, and yet there are even more high density access points, high value access points in the body, in the soma. And we're saying that the diaphragm is probably one of the key ones, right? It's a huge one. And that somebody can, while maybe being guided by a trained professional to begin to kind of explore it, they don't need to then depend on that trained professional for the rest of their life. They can then, be handed off with these tools and these resources and your DVDs and these communities so that they can then continue this and they can continue the healing themselves and the maintenance of this. Is that fair to say?
Sure. I mean, the number of people, of emails or messages I get on a weekly basis of people that have never worked with our teachers, that have never met me, that have come across the products through our, our website, or have tried applications because of the free media that we put out. We put out really robust articles and blogs. You don't have to use our tools. You can MacGyver something. It's a pandemic. People, you can order something online, but people used to get the stuff in stores. Obviously that was an easy way to go. But I recommend people just roll up their yoga mat and make sure that that the yoga mat that they're using has a bit of give, and they can roll up their yoga mat and they can use it in the same way. So you don't have to have these products. It really is, I feel it's really about the application. Of course, I'm going to sell you a product, but it's really about the application and compounding certain virtues, certain parasympathetic virtues should be able to help flip a switch to build a tolerance. Now, here's another word for tolerance, but to build a tolerance for parasympathetic endurance. Because we have this incredible tolerance for sympathetic endurance. I mean, we run marathons, we work out like crazy, but in the mind body, fitness space, we really like, well, not we, I'm not speaking for everybody, but the value of super slow movement, the value of super subtle movement. I mean, Feldenkrais pioneered this decades ago, right? And then the value of bringing in other tools that can hasten this parasympathetic onset. And then how can you stay there? What are the tools we can use to just keep cycling this parasympathetic, safe parasympathetic state, so that we really do build this broader base for our own neural resilience, our own body's resilience. We're not going to recover if we don't rest. And we're not going to repair well if, well, I believe that repair happens when we give ourselves a little bit of massage and helping those spots that really are stuck from lack of movement or from behavioral choices or from scar tissue or whatever that's inhibiting full function.
Yeah. No, that's so wonderful. It's so well said. So then let's dive into, you mentioned sympathetic, parasympathetic. I'm going to assume that most of our listeners understand what those are and how they're relating to so many fields at this point. Can we explore a little bit of Stephen Porges' work, a little bit of Polyvagal Theory, and again, kind of bringing it back to this diaphragm and the fascial areas around it and how to access it? How would you describe, in your own words, how do you summarize the polyvagal theory and how it's relevant with the diaphragm?
So Porges describes, I think, the smallest fraction of a sentence, the science of safety. And so he describes how the evolution of the vagus nerve from when we were reptiles to mammals, the vagus ended up having its major stalk that goes from brainstem to viscera, right? So it's innervating all the digestive organs, also plugging into the lungs, also plugging into the sinoatrial node on the heart. And then it's also going towards this vocal production in the throat. But then it started to grow ventrally. And so portions of the vagus or portions of the vagus from its source nucleus. There's about 4 different source nuclei of the vagus and the brainstem, but some of those started to venture forward into muscles of the face, into muscles of expression, into our inner ear. And he calls this newer vagus our social engagement system. So the portions that allow us to suck, swallow, chew, and relate are this newer evolved vagus. And this newer evolved vagus, when it's well functioning, also helps to keep our older vagus nice and quiet and things digesting and humming along. He suggests, as I'm sure every psychotherapy theory from the beginning of time, that we're really evolved to be cooperative animals. We are a cooperative species. We really rely on each other for survival. And so it makes sense that we evolve pro-social features to be able to connect. But there are disruptions that can happen in utero or also through child development that can really alter the behavior of the vagus, and it can create issues that will show up later in life or issues in relating right now. So he had a real interest in neonatal health. Anyway, I'll stop there. I'll keep it.
So good. And again, this is what I love about your depth of knowledge, Jill. So no, but okay. So again, I'm going to summarize it. It's a cranial nerve. It's one of the 12 core nerves that kind of control a lot of the basic functions of our body. It's going everywhere, and yet it seems like there are two branches, an old one and a new one. And you said one is the dorsal, and that's doing most of our internal organs. Is that right? Yeah.
Yep.
And then there's a more evolved, newer one this is literally the first I've heard of this, and I'm embarrassed to say that, but there's this newer ventral, which means forward aspect of the vagus nerve, which is our prosocial, which is which I would assume we know that we're safe because of our connection with others. Is that
right? Yeah. So so those
okay.
Those head, neck, and face juts are sharing source nuclei with the trigeminal, with the facial, with the accessory, which is really interesting. Like, who doesn't totally love having their traps rubbed? Like, don't you feel so mellow and altered? Like too much. You're like, wow, I feel completely different. I feel like a different person, right? And also glossopharyngeal. And so it's sharing source nuclei in the brainstem with those. And so when we do applications that, and so that's, there's motor and sensory involved in there, except, yeah, okay.
No, that's good. I'm trying to put it all together. I'm picturing it. But it makes sense why some people say, oh, I hold my tension in my shoulders. Oh, I hold it. So there may be some relationship there, right? Like,
well, I mean, if you hold your tension in your shoulders, you're also going to be compressing the carotid sheath also. So there's going to be, there's potentially some mechanical, who knows, mechanical smushing around the carotid, maybe.
Okay. Yeah, totally. So, it's all good.
Okay. We defend ourselves. Our body chooses its way of defending itself. And what he says is that we are always being triggered. Our nervous system is always responding to the environment, and we don't know necessarily what it's responding to. And sometimes we just have we have feelings, and we have urges, and we have sort of sudden rushes, and we have, right, my body thinks and feels, and that a lot of this feedback is your body's, he calls this neuroception. So your body is always sensing areas of danger in the environment, and it will do things to protect or defend itself that you didn't initiate consciously. Your body is unconsciously protecting itself. So this behavior, this type of shielding, we could trace it towards polyvagal, defensiveness, but this behavior is challenging respirationally, because you're in I have to go back to the breath model that I live in, is that this puts us into the shape or the cast of a stress breather, which is not a good long-term strategy for health or well-being, because of that chronic tension, right? So that's just an overload of sympathetic stress. Like, this unnecessary sympathetic holding that we can probably do something about.
And for our listeners, that's what you're showing is basically the shoulders up towards the ears in this kind of guarded space, right? So shoulders up, forward, and kind of like collapsing my chest, because that's protective. That's a protective space. I feel more safe by doing that if I need. I've started doing some martial arts mostly because my kids are doing it, and I thought it was a good way for us to connect. And yet, that's what they're teaching us, is to, when you're fighting, right? When you are in battle, you need to be up and guarded. Like, your shoulders need to be up and protected, and your arms up, because you have to protect your vulnerable spots, right? And so that makes sense during a 15-minute, a 10-minute, sparring match. Probably not a good way to live your whole life, though, right? Probably not a good way to, when you're sitting at a desk or you're sitting eating a meal, what happened? Why am I still there? I should not be doing this, right? And yet there's something unconscious. We got locked,
Yeah,
right?
for
Uh,
sure.
so then how do we circle back to the diaphragm? What is the relationship between the diaphragm and breath and the vagus nerve? And how will
So,
fascial work help that?
so I'll explain a little bit more of my model, which is I talk about three zones of respiration. And there's the abdominal zone, which is subdiaphragmatic. And there's the supradiaphragmatic, which is everything between collarbones and diaphragm. And that's that thorax. And we often think of, when we think of subdiaphragmatic, we often think of calming breath, we think of restoration, recovery. When we think of the thorax, we often think of amplification, sympathetic energy. This is the area that needs to breathe really well when we're working out, right? Because you don't want to have, if when you're breathing thoracically, that means you have some good amount of tension in the subdiaphragmatic region, right? So you could try this right now, those of you that are listening. You can take an abdominal breath and allow the gut area to distend, the pelvic floor to sloosh out. You can maybe even feel your lower back expanding a bit. And then if you prevent that from happening, if you stiffen everything that's below the rib cage, you create tension. In order to breathe, you got to breathe somewhere. And so to transfer the breath into the thoracic region, and the thoracic region is going to give us a little bit of a shallower breath. This is more of a sort of sympathetic tone of breath, but it's a very important region nonetheless. So there's a cooperation between the intercostals and the diaphragm here. And the vagus is innervating both. Not in a muscular way, although there are bits of the vagus that pepper the esophageal hiatus in the central tendon of the diaphragm. And this has more to do with that you don't breathe in when you're throwing up. So the vagus is very involved in the lungs. However, the vagus has just an enormous amount of sensory neurons within the lungs, and that's really to provide the brain feedback about whether the air that you're breathing is toxic. So if if you walked into a sauna and all of a sudden you're like, oh, it hurts to breathe, it's hard to breathe deep, this is your vagus saying, oh shit, this is evil breath, and then you have to override that knowing you're doing something good for yourself. Or you're in a room full of smoke, you don't take deep breaths anymore. This is your vagus, very stealthily communicating beyond conscious awareness of how your body should breathe in this environment. So we've got a lot of vagal feedback in the lung area and as well in the heart, because the vagus is constantly adjusting the beating of the heart so that we're not running at 120 beats all the time. The vagus's input on the heart gives us around about 78 beats per minute on average. It slows the heart rate down when we're in homeostasis. If we need the vagus to evaporate on the heart, in cases of emergency, it'll just disappear, and your sympathetics will just take over and do the thing and get the heck out of Dodge. And then there's this other zone, this zone 3, which I call the supraclavicular zone. And in this supraclavicular zone, in terms of breathing, it's a pretty bad strategy. And it's what you were describing before. If you're using zone 3 respiratory muscles, you're using your scalenes, you're using your traps, you might even be using facial muscles to pull air in. You're in a fright state. You're in a very heightened, untenable long-term state. Many people, sit at their computers all day, leaning forward, one shoulder hiked up on their mouse, and their body starts to frame itself as a zone 3 respirer. Okay, so those are the muscles of respiration there. But in terms of vagal innervation, we just discussed it in the ventral vagus. Mostly we use this ventral vagus for communication, for cooperation, for digestion, or for mastication, for kissing, for intimacy. So there's lots of other pro-social.
Yes, for sure.
There seems to be like this. The zones of respiration and then the zones of vagal innervation that I outline in the book. There are these three zones, and they do different things in the different zones. So you would think, oh, well, zone 3 breathing should be happy breath. No, no, no. No, zone 3 breathing is what I would call bad breath, but zone 3 in terms of the, or excuse me, the supraclavicular in terms of the vagus is this ventral vagal system. But you can sort of subdivide into 3 and see, well, what does breath do in this zone? What does the vagus do in this zone? What does breath do in this zone? What does the vagus do in this zone? So I found that that was a really easy way for me to describe it to my students. They got it instantly, and these are all obviously, we've got this charted out, and you can see images of this in the book or in a lecture that's digestible.
Yes, and that's where the book is going to dive even deeper for our professionals and our listeners here. But this gives us a framework, which is what we need. We need better frameworks to understand some of these complex things. So, so then, if I have fascial restrictions around my diaphragm, around my ribs, if I have even maybe fascial restrictions somewhere else in my body, but because there are these connection points to my ribs and my diaphragm, could I create a persistent restriction, a persistent inability for these zones to breathe properly, thus kind of influencing my nervous system? So is there a bottom-up influence here?
Oh, sure. If you have scar tissue from abdominal surgeries, laparoscopic surgeries, or even, gosh, I had a client who had liposuction.
Oh, yeah.
And she had liposuction in her legs and her abdomen, and she ended up having she was never an anxious person before, but somehow the surgery of liposuction flipped a stress switch in her, and she was unable to breathe. She was in panic all the time from that intervention, and really, really sad story. But yes, oh shoot, I just got lost in my story. What was the question again?
Well, how the restrictions in our fascia and muscles will impact the diaphragm and thus impact our breathing, which will actually have a weird effect on our actual nervous system, on our vagal tone.
Yes. So yeah, what you just said was the answer. What you said is the answer. So
examples of that, right? Examples of that, because that's
right.
So that's your insight. Like I'm like, great, let me just give you this generic statement, but you know the ins and outs of it, right? So there's an example. Laparoscopic surgery is a perfect example of that. Right?
Yes, that's a great example. Other illnesses that, oh wow, I had one student who he had a virus that affected his right phrenic nerve. And so your diaphragm is innervated. So you have two hemispheres, like you have two biceps, you have two hemispheres, and they're each innervated by the right and left phrenic nerve. And so the phrenic nerve is the nerve also dropping from the brainstem that's telling the diaphragm to contract, and that's what's governing the activation of the diaphragm all the time, unless you override it by doing conscious breathing practices. So he had a paralysis from a viral infection. He was a meditation teacher too, this guy. And so it was driving him crazy, not feeling the right side of his, it was either the right or the left. It was one of them. I can't remember.
Sure. Yeah. One of them was broken. That's a big deal.
Right. And the doctor just said, look, it's going to take about 2 years. It'll come back online at a certain point, because that's how long it takes the nerve to repair. Just be patient. And so, the guy was like, this really sucks. And he ended up coming to, I taught a workshop called Diaphragm Tune-Up at a conference in Canada, in Toronto, a few years ago, before the pandemic. And I get this message from him. I don't know him. I never talked to him. I get this message from him via Facebook, either that night or the next morning. And he said, Mrs. Miller, I had the strangest thing happen. My diaphragm has been paralyzed for over 1.5 years. I had a viral infection, but I think I'm breathing again in that side. Like I can feel those ribs moving. And I said, wow, that sounds great. We did all the gorgeous ball and the diaphragm stuff. I was like, just go check in with your doctor when you get a chance. And so just keep me posted. And sure enough, they did the ultrasound, diaphragm's moving again. And he told his doctor what happened. The doctor was, was not like, the doctors see everything, I guess. But he was just like, well, just keep doing what you're doing. he didn't say, oh, it was because of the intervention that you did that happened, because he had already said it's going to come back online within 2 years. So, he's not going to give me that credit, but I'll take the freaking credit.
Yeah, right.
Well, he'll take the credit because the meditator did it. I didn't do it to him. He did it to himself.
Right.
That's the beauty of it. I just suggested something, and he followed my guidance, and he had a great result. But I've seen this has happened to, I think, 2 or 3 different students, who've had paralysis. Other interesting, I love these stories. I have so many of them. It just takes me a while to
Yes.
to put them up into my memory bank. One of my sub passions is singing. I just love singing. I sang as a kid. I stopped singing in college because I wasn't as good as everybody else. I wasn't as good as everybody else because I was also bulimic. So I was throwing up all the time. And that did not help with being able to hit high notes or actually have any integrity in my diaphragm's inner life. And we can talk about, I mean, I did mention a little bit about vagus and throwing up. But anyway, I was very dysregulated. And, but fast forward, whatever, 30 years, I'm working in LA. People hear about my work. There's a professor at USC that wants me to come in and work with their vocal department and work with the students, intervene now at age 18, 19. You know what I'm saying? 18, 19, get this stuff in their body now.
Right, yes.
And so, they do a vocal warm-up prior to the rollout, because we made this sort of scientific. They do the vocal warm-up, and me and my assistants are all like, oh my God, this is amazing. And then we do their rollout, about an hour practice, and then they do their vocals afterwards. And yeah, it's like being on Elon Musk's, or whatever's, what's this guy's name, the spaceship. It is insane.
Right, on the SpaceX going up in
right. But then I get an email from the professor a little later in the afternoon, or that night. She says, I went to go teach my class 4 hours later, and I started singing, and these sounds were coming out of me that I haven't been able to produce in decades, because I have a partial vocal cord paralysis, and I've just learned to sing around it. But the massage that we did, because when we do the vagus work, the vagus voyage diaphragm work, we also do massage along the anterior neck, and we do massage carotid sheath very gently, and we also do some suboccipital work. We address the traps, but there was enough musculoskeletal woo-woo pressure going on in there that triggered dormant neurons in her partially paralyzed vocal cord, that she was able to regain full vocal function. And she says now she just uses them all the time. Wow. And so these are, I mean, it makes sense if you think about the mechanism, the potential mechanism, because we don't have evidence, don't have double-blind studies and blah, blah, blah. But I've certainly accumulated enough testimonials, certainly to write my second book, right? I've already got a first book called The Role Model, and this is the second book that's really concentrating on this axial stuff that is so cool. We're not talking about the hands and the thumbs and the feet, and the butt in this one. But, we could talk about that too, because it's all connected via the fascia. But for the vagus specifically, we want to really hone in on this trunk and this axis.
Yeah, because at some point we have to create artificial categories and separations, so that we can just have a conversation about it, right? So that we can communicate about it. And we do know that everything is connected, but at some point, everything is food, right? Food is food, and yet we still have Italian food and Mexican food. We still have these differentiators because it gives us some kind of map system to make sense of it and communicate it, right? But at some point, we have to kind of go back and say, yes, but maybe these artificial categories aren't enough to get more understanding, and we need to start to come up with better models as to how.
Yeah, well, it's one of the reasons why I love the idea of interprofessional communities. At a yoga therapy conference that I presented at a few years ago, I did the same work, And this woman came up to me afterwards and she said, I wonder, she had the cordless ball. She's like, I wonder if this would help my patients. I said, oh, what type of work do you do? She goes, well, I'm a pelvic cancer surgeon. She's down in Houston at Anderson, right? I was like, it's funny that you say that, because I'm always telling my people who've recovered from pelvic and abdominal surgeries to go ask their surgeon. So let's have this conversation right now. Yes. She doesn't know because she has never had this experience. And then she said, you know what? And then she pulled up the yoga tune-up ball, and she's like, and I think this move would really help my nerves. And she starts pointing to the innervation of the traps, right? That accessory nerve. And I was like, I'm sure it would really help your nurse with her stress. So it was like, here, let me prescribe to you these rubber drugs. And then I need you if I end up having a pelvic cancer. And then so it's like there is this chasm. And those of us in the Fascia Research Society, we're really keen on trying to inspire and mobilize the medical field to this. There's no side effects. There's no chemical side effects. I mean, maybe you'll be a little sore the next day, but I promise it'll be worth it. And like this book here, this is the first of its kind, fascia function medical applications. And they've already asked them, I think, for another edition with more topics. So.
Which is so huge and so necessary. And again, to bring the fascia, to bring structure into the general conversation around health and how it applies on so many levels is what this is about. And it's what you've been dedicating your life to, which I'm so grateful for. And it seems like there are certain voices that are really helping to amplify this. And so one is Andrew Huberman, MD, out of Stanford. It may have, we were all together, about 2 years ago here in Pasadena at a brain health conference that was an interprofessional conference on the brain. We all went out to dinner afterwards. And
I remember it so vividly. It was such an incredible evening. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yes. And it was, not only a wonderful time of like-minded or kindred spirits to sit down and talk about what we're doing and our passions and our purposes, but it also started to I think it's been leading to other conversations that have been really helpful. And I know that Andrew Huberman has flown down and he's participated in another workshop that you've done recently. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah. And he he's reached escape velocity, I say, and he has now shared significant amount of research on breath, on breath's role with nervous system arousal levels and stress, and so it's starting to enter the zeitgeist, right? Him and other voices as well. There's I'm sitting here because I've read it now 3 times, but James Nestor wrote a book called Breath, and do you have yours? Is it there too? Yes, there you go. See?
Yeah, this is the one I'm reading now.
Oh, there you go. See, yes. And so, of course, very relevant, right? So.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. You can't see that. I held up my breath copy of James's, and I actually am on his website. He did an interview with me about fascia.
That's wonderful.
So, he's so cool. What a great writer. I have so many quotes of him in my book. And then this is relatively new. This is by Michael Stephen. It's called Breathtaking. He's a pulmonologist, The Power, Fragility, and Future of Our Extraordinary Lungs.
Wow.
We're never going to know everything. This is just incredible. We are in the time, man.
Yes, but we are in a time and what I love about this is that they're talking about, look, we all need to improve our anxiety tolerance, right?
Yeah.
We all need to find a way to adapt to a world that was already stressful. Like, if anybody remembers, we always talk about going pre-COVID, but pre-COVID was already stressful.
Oh my God, yeah.
Like, we were already overworked. We were already spread too thin. We were already, feeling like we've got very little left in the tank, and then COVID hit, right? Yeah. So, and it seems like this isn't going to go away as far as the stress goes. This isn't going to be something where it's all going to just magically disappear. So we need to do this, and we need more tools. So Andrew Huberman, James Nestor's the Joe Millers of the world are increasing popular awareness on how breath and how our breath is going to help us improve our anxiety tolerance. And yet, in the breath conversation, our structure, the physical restrictions that are influencing our ability to breathe outwards, longer than we breathe in, and to have longer, deeper breaths, to even have the diaphragm expand when the abdominal muscles are keeping it. Like, the structure is such a valuable key to the whole breath conversation, right? And that's where you have just wonderful insight. You've got 30 years. You're ready for it. You're poised for it. So I just so appreciate that, and I so appreciate the conversation that's happening.
It's funny. I mean, this is the book I've always wanted to write. When I was approached by Victory Belt Publishers, that's the team that produced my friend Kelly Starrett's book, Becoming Supple Leopard.
Oh, yeah.
I was doing a project with Kelly, and they saw me doing the project with him on internet, on Creative Live, and they approached me. Like, they sent me an email the next day. They said, we want to publish your book. And I was like, well, I don't have a book. And they said, well, write one and we'll publish it for you. Not how it happens, right? It's not how that, I mean, and I had written other book proposals. I had other books that I had in mind, but when they said we want your book, I knew that whatever I had written before wasn't what was like what I wanted to write, what I really wanted to write. And so what I really wanted to write was the book I'm writing right now, which is the book on breath. But this was in 2012 when they approached me. I knew that breath was not a trend. Like, it wasn't even a blip. And that for me to try to bring that forward, it would have just gotten buried. It wouldn't have done anything. But I did know that self-myofascial release was a rising trend, and that I was a voice in that space and had a lot to contribute to it. And so I wrote the role model, step-by-step guide to erase pain, improve mobility, and live better in your body. Long subtitle. And then immediately they're like, what's your next book? I was like, and I said, here's what I want to do. And then I described this book to them, and they were like, okay, let's do it. And it's taken me 7 years to write it. So I don't know when James started his book, but I have a feeling we started writing at the same time. I'm so glad he went first, because I could not have, he kicked open the why.
Yes.
In the biggest,
absolutely,
broadest way possible. And then you have these amazing digests. I mean, Andrew is a digest. He's a digest of science, and he puts it out there. Sometimes it's simple, sometimes it's complex, and you can take it at whatever level you're able to process what he said. But he helped me really understand Jack Feldman's work in a way that I had read some of the stuff, but for some reason, none of it really stuck. And then once I heard him interview Jack, and then I got to connect with Jack. I taught together with Jack and with Andrew at this Breath Collective retreat out in Topanga. By the way, these retreats sell out before they even get published. There's another one in October. Like, it's crazy. It's hot. I'm telling you, it's hot stuff. Anyway, Jack has been, I don't want to call him a pocket neuroscientist, but he's answered a number of crazy questions I've had and clinical hunches, and he's really been able to kind of talk me down off of some of my thoughts, and help me try to steer the boat straight. I know that there's going to be statements and claims I make in my book that are not going to sit well with all people, but I'm okay with that because of what I see in my clients and my student community. And that's just part of the rigor, is that we're all trying. We're also speaking to different contexts frequently. But I also, in the back of my brain at all times is my dad, who's actually a frontline worker. He's an infectious disease doctor, and he has been working this pandemic since the beginning. In fact, he warned me in January of 2020. So the first COVID case had hit Seattle. and that person perished, and that made national news. And I called my dad, said, Dad, I'm flying to Seattle this weekend to teach at a conference at the convention center. And my dad said, don't leave your house, lock the doors and windows, don't get on a plane. And I was like, come on. So of course I went, but then the drum beat was on. Like you could feel what was about to happen. And early on in the pandemic, my dad's 76. Like I cannot believe he has not gotten COVID. Like it's incredible. He's in there with, he's in the ICU like every day.
Right.
But one of the things he said to me early on in the pandemic, because it was actually during the pandemic that my publisher reached back out because I had let my writing go dormant. I had let it go dormant while I wrote this fascia chapter for the medical textbook. And I was really afraid to look at what I had already written. I'd already written probably over 100,000 words, but that's a psychotherapy podcast, maybe a different podcast than this one, like to deal with what that writer's block was for me. It's very significant and had a lot to do with my own stuff, which of course is in the book somehow. But he said, so the long story, right? So Victory Belt reached out to me. They go, so how's the breath book coming along? It's really kind of needed now. And I was like, you're right. And they helped me strategize a plan. They helped me focus my energy in the right way so that I could get to the point where we've got a publishing date and we're so close. And I told my dad that I was, writing this book, and he said, just do that book. It's so needed. He's like, this is never going to change. And what he meant by is that people are, the lung thing has reached a critical velocity in culture and as a part of just people's health regimen, and their fitness regimen needs to account for what is happening in this whole respiratory apparatus. And so he's like, I can't wait to tell my colleagues about it. And that just made me feel really happy that my dad also sees a need for it. And so that's my little therapy story.
I think right. Because there's all connected, right? It's a big part of our why, right? And sometimes there's history behind our why, and that's a big one. And that's what I love is people like Andrew Huberman and others are bringing to the forefront really some of the social validation to a lot of the things that people have been doing, not just over the last 30 years, as you've been doing, Jill, but as through your experience with yoga, thousands of years, and the ability for something to work will continue to work, whether or not we can understand the full mechanism.
Wonderful.
Right, and so, when you have somebody like yourself who's been so committed to helping individuals experience that breakthrough and experience that connection, in the absence of all of this social validation, and sometimes 100% against where socially and convention is saying this is absolutely wrong. This is absolutely not the right course. The commitment to what your experience has shown is paying off, right? I mean, it already has on so many levels, but here's yet another chapter of that happening, right? And here you have now the book that will be able to give a little bit more insight and light to some of that. Right?
Yeah, well, you look at like Eileen Langevin. I think she's the chair of the at the NIH, the Institute for Complementary.
Okay.
The full title of that, the complementary health and interdisciplinary. You know what I'm saying? Like that division of the NIH. So she's the one that discovered what the acupuncture needles are doing with collagen.
Right.
So she's like for us, she's a titan of fascia. Just an amazing researcher and applicator and clinician. And she gave the opening talk at the annual Society for Gastroenterologists, I don't know, last year or the year before. And part of her keynote was manual interventions work on digestive diseases. We don't need to just medicate these patients all the time. And, and including hernias and other maladies that she mentioned. And that was one of those things that just made me just so happy. I mean, she didn't say rolling on balls is, but it's like I extrapolate to this is really good movement in the right direction to get in front of, to get in front of the old guard and in front of these societies and say, here's what's working. Here's these old school things that are actually working.
Right.
Now let's get in there and
let's bring that back and get in there. Yeah, and I looked it up. So it's the NIH National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health. And again, we'll include that in the show notes as well. Yes, I mean that's really the hope.
They've done some stuff. I think in their portal you can find there was a webinar on fascia and cancer, fascia and pain. So she's really bringing fascia forward.
Fascia forward. Yep. So if again, I'm going to circle back to keep the string throughout our conversation. One of the biggest challenges we're seeing is the inability for people to have this anxiety tolerance and inability to manage ourselves and our state of arousal. And it looks like our breath is one of these amazing tools, and the diaphragm and the fascia that controls it or that influences it is it's a major entry point to accessing this, right? And you have such insight into that. So important for all practitioners that deal with anybody who's dealing with health and wellness right now. It just needs to be on their radar, right? It needs to be on their radar.
Agreed. And it's also not, I mean, obviously giving somebody a breath as a tool is a great intervention, but from my perspective, often a little stimulation can help that intervention be more effective. And by stimulation, I mean either some type of movement that's joined with the breath, or a manual intervention using self-massage, because that's what I teach, is self-massage, can really expand the body's ability to perform that breath tool. One of the things that I see immediately with most people when I teach breathing is that they don't know how to disassociate clavicular activation when they're doing quote unquote deep breaths. So an abdominal thoracic breath, a breath that manipulates, the descent of the diaphragm and then allows for the upward rotation of the ribs, often is unconsciously coupled with a heaving or a lifting of the shoulders. And so there's a time and the place to use your shoulders to help breath get in, but not in terms of inducing calm or trying to adjust the autonomic nervous system so that you're trying to improve parasympathetic value. So that's really a big teaching, especially when I go work with breath workers, because I see a lot of them using sympathetic affect to get maximum respiration. And
right, which can be
I just want people to be aware of what part of their apparatus they're giving gas to, literally.
Yeah.
And so it's helpful. That's why I feel like this overlay of, well, what's the vagus, where are the vagus innervations, and what are the zones of respiration, and then what really is the practice I'm intending, what's the effect I'm trying to get at here. So if I want to increase parasympathetic value, then I need to really work on disassembling these extra sympathetic tensions, and there's ways to do that.
Right, because it's just as important to learn to disengage certain things, like up here I'm pointing at my, around my throat and above my clavicles, as well as to even understand and access what to engage, which would be maybe my lower abdominals and my diaphragm, and the sides of my abdominals, right, allowing those to expand. All those, so just maybe, it's a starting point for the James Nestors of the world to say, look, your breath directly influences a lot of things, including your stress level. So maybe you should focus more on your breath. And then people may say, okay, how? right? And so then there's a group that's going to say, well, if you breathe more on the out breath than on the in breath, you'll do one thing. And if you breathe more on the in breath than the out breath, you do another thing. And they say, okay, great, I'm trying to do that. How? Then you have the Jill Millers of the world that say, okay,
here's your body, here's how it works.
you finally access this, right? Yeah.
That's why it's body. That's why it's body by breath. Your body by breath, your inspiring journey to physical and emotional resilience.
Yes. Yeah. It's so necessary. So necessary. We're going to start wrapping up in the next 10, 15 minutes, and again, we can take this in any direction, Jill. But do you mind? Can we chat for a second, based on our conversation at dinner back 2 years ago?
Okay.
A little bit about what got you into this work. You said 19. You're interested in breath, but there's a whole story around you going to India and
no, I never went to India.
working with some pretty important teachers from India and their lineage. So excuse me, you didn't go to India.
Okay.
But what I do remember from the conversation was that there was a deep immersion in the yoga world that goes beyond just what we now know as popular yoga.
Oh, sure.
Be that. What led you to that? And has there anything? So one, what led you to that? But has there? Sometimes we kind of go not just full circle once, but we kind of revisit things in different stages. Where are you at now? Is there a revisiting of some of that? Is there a reintegrating of some of that? So what happened, and then where are you now?
So I started doing yoga around age 11, 12 in 6th grade. My mom brought home the Raquel Welch yoga video in beta. And we lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico, off the grid. So we had a solar home and there was no television reception. And so we would watch videos. So she brought home, and I was overweight. I was an overweight kid. And she brought home this Jane Fonda workout and this Raquel Welch yoga video, which, by the way, is the Diaphragm series, and he later sued her. So my yoga people out there, you're probably laughing because Diaphragm sued everybody. But that was my initial experience of yoga, was Raquel Welch's video. And I became hooked on these videos, and I would do them back to back. And it led me to get into my body as a tween. Fortunately, it led me beyond my body, and I became anorexic, and I became orthorexic. So I was over-exercising and lost a lot of weight in an unhealthy way. But this was really how I discovered my body, because I was completely separate from it prior to that. And then I'll leapfrog, because that was my initial entry. And then I started getting Yoga Journal magazine, and we lived in Santa Fe, and ultimately I found a teacher somewhere. I did work study and found a teacher like when I was in high school. But when I went to college at Northwestern University, I would take yoga like through the university, and then I started studying shiatsu massage on the side. I did work study, and all the while, by the way, I'm bulimic, and this is a very important part of the whole story, because I'm really questing for health. I'm really trying to find how to heal myself, and I'm going into all these different healing arts modalities, hiding my illness, but also when I feel safe, telling a teacher about my illness. And that's actually how I learned to do abdominal massage. Was I told the yoga teacher that I couldn't feel my abs and that I was bulimic. Somehow I knew these things were connected. I knew that my mental health was, this dissociation of my insides, right? So she had me lay down on this tool, which looked like a beanbag. It was a Iyengar yoga prop. And she said, put this on your abdomen, lay face down and breathe. And really that was the genesis of what is now the Porges ball. So that practice of literally getting in touch and touching my own pain and having more than pain come out, right? So I was finally able to feel so much more than pain. I was able to really feel what I was running from and stuffing down all along. I met my teacher, Glenn, my yoga teacher, my first mentor, Glenn Black, when I did work study around that same time, around 19, through the shiatsu school, I heard about this place in upstate New York called the Omega Institute for Holistic Studies. This is before,
roughly.
this is, well, this was 1990, 1990 or 91. I mean, I didn't have a computer. I didn't have email. Like, I wrote them a letter, like handwritten letter. And then there was a phone interview. And then they're like, okay, there's a tent site for you. And you can work the whole summer living in the tent. And you can work in the sundry store selling toothpaste and flashlights and stuff. And the staff who worked at the Omega Institute got to take classes, amazing classes with, it was the New Age movement. And so this was, Deepak Chopra and Ram Dass and you name it, like all of them came through there. It was incredible. And my teacher taught the staff yoga. His name was Von Black. And that's when I healed from bulimia, like living in the tent and living in community. It just changed my life. But there's a longer story. I'll tell you the shorter version. So Glenn really took me under his wing and taught me. He's very, very old school kind of teacher. Like you just learn by being there, and he answers no questions. And because it's so confounding what's happening, I would be forced to like go research and try to figure out what the heck is happening. And he talked a lot about fascia, like when he taught, but he's not really a big talker. He was a body worker trained by a Russian named Shmuel Tatz and orthopedic manual massage. And so he did a type of body work called body tuning. And they worked at Carnegie Hall, and they would work on the musicians at Carnegie Hall in New York City. And like, someone would get repetitive stress. They'd run downstairs, get a tune up, and go back upstairs and keep playing. So it's just a really interesting methodology. It's a type of orthopedic medical massage. And so Glenn used to incorporate this orthopedic medical massage into his yoga classes, and they were blended. Like if he was unhappy with how a pose was done, he would literally throw us on the ground, not throw, but put us on the ground, and then start to manipulate our tissues and joints, teach us how to manipulate each other's tissues and joints, and then get back into the pose. And this is where I learned that, about proprioception and about stimulation of tissues in order to get them to what one calls become less recalcitrant, right? So that they were participating and tuning up. And by the way, this is why I named my work Yoga Tune Up, and it paid respect to Shmuel and to Glenn and to this Rebbe body work.
Never heard that before.
I got trained in. But Glenn ended up, there's a longer story. So Glenn ended up doing these month-long immersions in Costa Rica. And that's probably what you got mixed up with India. So yep. We would go down to Costa Rica for 1 month per year. Very small group of us, very small group. And we would do like 8 hours of practice a day. That I always say it sounds like a cult. It wasn't, because I got out of there the other 11 months of the year. But what he really wanted to experiment with us and find out if we did the type of practice that he did, if we would have the same kind of result. And so morning was like 2 hours of hip openers. And then afternoon class would be a standing poses class, all classes followed by meditation and yoga nidra, a lot of 30-minute yoga nidras. And then in the evening, we worked on a type of meditation from the Bihar School of Yoga called Kriya meditation, which takes about 2.5 hours to do, and it's very complicated, but it's very autonomic nervous system. It feels like you're literally playing the different gateways, the different entry points of stimulating parasympathetic dominance. You sphincters, play with light, head position, different body positions, different bandhas, Jalandhara bandha, Uddiyana bandha, Mula bandha. Really fascinating. The system of meditation, I'm told, was really refined by, Saraswati Sadhyananda. Unfortunately, as with many yoga sects, there was a lot of impropriety, horrible abuses happened there. but the work that came out of that center was, part of what I was taught. Glenn wasn't a part of them. He learned it from the book. He learned it first from a Swami, and then from this amazing book I can show you. It's 1,000 pages. I have 2 copies of it. It's one of the best yoga texts I've ever read in my life. In fact, I was in it yesterday looking up something for my book. So that was a really big part of my education. And then and Glenn also shared all his hands-on strategies with me and other students. And so his work is just indelible in the work I do. Now, I'm very consumer facing. I'm also very professional facing. So I'm able to really explain things. Glenn doesn't really like to entertain questions. He doesn't like to do interviews like this. And I certainly go in many different directions than his work went, but his perspective and his quest for the life of a yogi in the forest is I'm very, very, very fortunate. It was very wax on, wax off type of relationship with him.
Yeah. Which
doesn't happen.
And again, the idea about the importance of collaboration, because researchers are needed, and yet a researcher does not have, like you said, boots on the ground. You have experience with so much of actual working with people, but it's also yourself. It's your own life. It's your own experience. So you have so many layers of insight. So, I mean, thank you for sharing that, first of all. It just adds some flavor and some dimension to all of your knowledge. Jill, I mean, how do you want to leave us? Is there anything that you want to leave us with, an insight, other than your book, which we'll include, but what else?
I will say that I love collaborating, and in the last year, we put out a couple of products, one with my friend Tom Myers, calling Rolling Along the Anatomy Trains, where we take a look at, we kind of smush up our approaches, and Tom gives anatomy lectures that are to die for. I mean, they're unbelievable. And then I provide movement and rollouts. And then I did a collaboration with Katie Bowman called Walking Well. Katie Bowman and the Purchase Movement. She's an amazing biomechanist. And I just did a thing with Gil Hetley last week on the abdominal wall and the diaphragm. But what I'm saying to the interprofessional community is, if those of you whose interest is piqued, I would love to find out how our work is, it has a shared mission of helping empower people with self-care healthcare, and find ways of working together, either sharing students or clients, what have you, or even seeing a potential for collaboration with our mutual community. So I'd love to talk to those of you in that with that interest.
Fantastic, and we're gonna include all of those resources in the show notes, and we'll continue to open the door for more collaboration, because you are a gift, and there are so many other people doing wonderful things, and these collaborative projects are just it's ready. This is the season for it. So, Jill, thank you for joining us. I appreciate you so much.
I think I could talk to you forever, because I have a million questions for you about the brain. So
yes, another time, whatever you would like. Yes. Oh boy.
But I want to come over there. I have some serious questions for you.
Completely welcome to. And again, if we had a bottom up conversation today, we can have a total top down conversation. That whenever you'd like, you let me know.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jill. I know you have to go. Thank you for your time, and we'll include everything in the notes.
Bye, guys. Thanks all.
Thanks for listening. As always, you can check the show notes for more detail on how to follow up with us or contact Jill Miller. See you next time.